Hi, this is Steve Edison for the Movements Podcast, the podcast for people who want to multiply disciples and churches everywhere. Today we're talking to Emanuel Prinz about movements of disciples and churches in Sudan.
So picture me as a 21-year-old greenhorn, and I was in theological seminary in Germany and had just started. And we had one series of lectures, Introduction to Missiology, just 15 lectures. And one of them, my missions professor, a Canadian Mennonite, Hans Karsdorff, devoted to the topics of people movements. It blew my mind. Wow. It caught my attention. So after 45 minutes of lecture, I was shaking my head and thinking, wow, why am I only now hearing about movements? Why is not every missionary who comes to our chapel talking about movements? Why is not every missionary who came to my home church talking about movements? Why? This is amazing. This is fascinating. So, 45 minutes, and he talked a bit about Westcomb Pickett and Christian mass movements in India, and Alan Tippett and people movements, as it was called at the time, in southern Polynesia, and a little bit about McGavran and the Bridges of God. But boy, he had me fascinated. Fascinated to the degree that I told you I was a young radical, a newbie but radical. I decided I want to learn anything I can about movements. So I drove to the university library. There's a library in Germany that has the mandate to buy any theological, missiological book that is published anywhere in the world, right? Most countries have that. So I knew that my library would have any book that has ever been published on movements. And I went into the library and photocopied page by page of all the books. There were only a handful, but, half a dozen. Photocopied every single book page that I could find at that time to do with movements, and studied. And I was by myself. I didn't find any fellow student who was equally interested in the topic. And that's what prepared me for ministry among Muslims in the Sudan. So, with a highlighter and a pencil, writing observations, and then I started a Word file. I'm always someone who thinks application, thinks implementation. Well, what's the practical takeaway from this great theory? And I've started a Word file on my first computer to say, what does it mean in terms of implementation? What are practical steps that I can glean from this for ministry? So, for example, I'd never heard of the concept of multi-individual conversion. To think instead of extracting, and that was the model of the time pretty much, especially among those ministering among Muslim, extracting Muhammad, extracting Muna, and then trying to build a little house church around them, while they're most likely alienated from their family, to think, how can I understand, read, authority structures in society, connections, relationships, and rather steer a whole group, like a household, what the Book of Acts calls an oikos, an extended family, into the kingdom. How can I focus on leaders? In Sudan, typically in rural societies, the so-called sheikhs, the traditional village chiefs. How can I make sure, they are part of a process? So I developed a vision to really bring a whole people group into the kingdom, which God confirmed. God gave me a vivid dream as I prayed over a particular people group in Sudan, and showed me that, yes, there would be a big move of God among that people group one day. And that was at a time when there were maybe 2 or 3 non-believers. So it was absolutely unengaged at the time and just less than a handful of believers there. But when I hit the ground in Sudan, it was with the prayer, and my team and I were praying for nothing less than a movement. So when we did pray together several times a week, we did pray for a neighbor, Faisal, and, for a neighbor, Asha, but we also prayed for the village chiefs. We also prayed for a movement and reached out to people, always not only seeing the individual, but seeing the network behind them and thinking, how could we place, the good news most effectively in this community?
And so how did you go sort of taking what you've learnt from practitioners about movements, but then applying it in Sudan?
Right. Trying out a lot of things. So we experimented, with identity. How do we present ourselves? Well, initially, you learn Arabic and then we're Christian. Okay, every Muslim nods and draw or close. You're in the box and the conversation is over because now they know what you believe and what you stand for. And it's not worthwhile entertaining in any spiritual conversation, right? Because a Muslim is superior in his understanding of God and the truth than from a Christian. So then we experimented. Well, what does that mean if we say, well, I'm a follower of Jesus, of Isa, or I have surrendered my life to God in Isa. So we always wanted to bring Jesus into the conversation. So experimenting with who are we? How do we present ourselves? And experimenting then what is good news for Muslims? So as we were diving deeper into the culture, we got to know the brokenness and their pain and their hungers. And then thought, how can we formulate a gospel message that is truly good news to them? That is the good news of the kingdom. Jesus says, he was preaching the good news of the kingdom. So in other words, to me, in essence, whatever we formulate as good news has to be the kingdom of God. But what is the expression of the kingdom of God for these people? Meeting their needs, meeting them where they are in life at the time that we have the conversation with them. So that was a whole process of experimenting, always thinking again, how can we develop a message that is good news for this entire people group? And who do we need to relate to, reach out to, love on, and then share with so that there is a gradual opening for the good news, not only among a handful of individuals, but at a communal level.
And did you see those breakthroughs happen?
We did not see it at the desired scale in the big city. Now that is interesting, and have long thought and analyzed what might have led to this. So we did see fruit. My neighbor from across the road, let's call him Frank, he came into the kingdom, even though my Arabic was still broken. We used some English as well, but, so at an early stage, I had arrived in the neighborhood 8 months before, and he committed to Christ. And we saw a house church established. Now, the model didn't work fully, and I guess one of the reasons was that we're still learning and experimenting ourselves. And we only saw men come into the kingdom. So again, it was individual conversion, individual decision. And because it was only men, it didn't include the wives, it didn't include the children. And also it was mostly younger men who were not opinion leaders in society, who were not, authority figures whose word had weight. So we saw some fruit in the city, but not a movement. Then we deliberately moved into a rural area. I had read at the time that most people movements start in rural areas, in village contexts, where society is still more closely knit. And that's what we did. And reached out to the village chiefs. So it was a humanitarian context. We had an identity as NGO workers, started an NGO with a supplementary feeding program for malnourished children, a primary health care, a clinic in a tent, this type of thing, to express, the compassion of Christ. But we wanted, again, an identity question. We had learned that now. from day one, we wanted to make sure they perceive us as spiritual people, as people who are different from the other white faces they had known. So had a meeting to get to know the village chiefs of the wider area. Picture me under a tree with 50 chiefs, and basically said, we are here to serve you and your people, your society. We also want you to know we're people who serve God with our lives and with this with these services here. So a spiritual identity established from the very first encounter, I believe, was key. And then bring Jesus into every conversation. That was our approach in a, again, contextual, sensitive way, not in an obnoxious way, but, bring him into every conversation. Well, why are you here? Well, why is a white man in a underdeveloped, civil war-torn rural area? Well, the answer, I could have told them anything, but has to do with Jesus, and was basically, in essence, I'm one of the followers of Jesus, and Jesus really exhorts his followers to express compassion to the needy. And I heard about your need here, and so that's the reason we're here. Any question? So, do you think there is hope that we would have peace here again? Well, again, that requires a longer answer. Why don't we have peace? But in essence, Jesus is, in Islam, the Nabi as-Salam, the Prince of Peace. You can only have peace with each other between tribes and in your families, from village to village, if you first have peace with God in your heart. And peace with God you can have, if you put your trust in Jesus. So bring Jesus into every conversations, basically. And then realize they were generally open. First, it was probably the respect for the outsider, the foreigner, the NGO director. But then I realized they started to think for the first time, probably in their life, seriously about, and a paradigm, an alternative paradigm than the one that people group had believed in for 500 years. 100% of them, they had never even considered an alternative. And so they began to ask more questions. Again, I focused my outreach mostly on village heads, opinion leaders, included also other influencers like the teachers of schools, for example, thinking, they are shaping the next generation. They also have a power position in society. Tried also imams in mosques in friendly, respectful dialogue, yet unmistakably and unapologetically bringing the Jesus into every conversation. Cut a long story short, realized they are more open than I'd ever dreamed they would be. So we're praying for a movement, but somehow I had thought, we'll see a movement maybe after 20 years. 20 years of compassion ministry, serving their needs holistically, sowing the seed. And, like the waters are rising. With every year that passes by, there is more seed sown. There is more gospel conversation among the people. And then at some point, we'll see a breakthrough. It happened much, much earlier.
What did that breakthrough look like?
Very good question. And here we come to the main topic of our conversation, the person of the catalyst. So we'll talk about it in a moment. I don't want to preempt, but my study and my book identified that one characteristic of every movement catalyst anywhere is boldness. So I'm not naturally a bold person. I was a shy young man. So here we had lots of opportunity to share Jesus, but I realized in my heart there's much more possible. And I said to myself and to God, Father, I'm afraid my lack of boldness is the minimum factor here. Fill me with boldness. Fill me with boldness so I can seize this opportunity, this door that's opening up fully. I'm grateful for the programs, but I think they're receptive. And so I prayed for boldness. Every morning I got up, and the first thing I did, sitting with my Bible under the tree in my courtyard of my house, is, Father, give me more boldness. And I did this for a couple of weeks. And one morning I literally jumped up from my seat and I said, I'm going to preach to them. Now, again, this is a context, 100% Muslim society. There have been Muslims for 500 years. There is the picture of this. So we're talking, these conversations with the sheikhs take place under the trees. And there is just 50 meters away, sit a couple of guys with an AK-47, the rebel army commanders, very intently, listening in to anything that's happening. We're also told there is government spies everywhere. So in other words, if we make the wrong move, they give us the boot. They close down the NGO and give me 5 days to leave the country. So the stakes were high. And yet, I'm going to preach. Which means I need to explain, not a 3-point expository Sunday morning sermon. As we had identified that telling stories is the approach, and telling stories that integrate with their worldview and then expand their worldview. So here I was and thought, I'm gonna talk to Sheikh Adam. Sheikh Adam was the senior sheikh, again, authority structures, right? Thinking multiplication, Sheikh Adam being the door opener, the person of peace. How about on my next visit, I said, Sheikh Adam, we have these wonderful conversations about truth and the word of God and about Jesus. But then, my satellite phone rings or my VHF radio and I need to run to the clinic because there's something. And again, we get interrupted. I think we need much more time. How about you invite your fellow sheikhs, and we have a meeting where we just explore truth together. Great idea, he thought. And he sent emissaries on donkeys in the surrounding villages. And we agreed on a date. And sure enough, on that date, more than 50 village chiefs showed up. Now, I said boldness is a key quality of movement catalyst. I naturally am not a bold man. So here I was, and, I had these 50 guys. And we talked about the next vaccination campaign that fell within our responsibility as an agency providing primary health care. And planned that for, about 45 minutes, an hour. And my heart sank, and I thought, I think this was a crazy idea. Maybe I just dismiss them, and few will notice probably, that we didn't tackle what we actually came for. And I was about to say this, and then something in my spirit, stood up and said, no. And I said, Lord, now give me boldness. And I kind of got up again, and then basically started a meeting where I told chronologically the story of creation that is perfect and good and the fall. The prophets, common ground with Muslims who also tried to reach God based on their own merits and how they all failed and fell short, and how Jesus is the bridge into the kingdom of God. And there was amazing openness. So I tell the story of Ibrahim, of Abraham, and David, and Moses. They're from figures they are familiar with, and point out in each of the life of these prophets how they were godly men, righteous men who sought God with all their hearts, and yet they all had flaws in their lives. They all failed. Abraham lied. David committed adultery. Moses hit the rock in anger. And so forth. And so it is dialogical as much as possible. So I asked them, so do you think that Abraham was a completely righteous man? Do you think his righteousness was sufficient that he would, make it back to paradise and be flawless before God? And the same with the other prophets. And then I said, well, now we have seen the prophets. And they, as we all agree here, right, they have failed. Their merits were not sufficient to open up the kingdom of God back to them. If they failed, do you think we today have a chance? And, you could feel it, even though it wasn't a room, it was open field and, the village school in the background and the children playing. It was sudden silence and you could feel the conviction. So in that dialogical way, I had prepared an ending where I wanted to give them a chance to respond. So it wasn't one-way communication at all. It was always back and forth, and also with the motivation they could express their hearts and thoughts. At the same time, I knew where do they stand, because what I learned from my studies later is a key competency of movement catalyst is the ability to change the beliefs, to challenge and then influence the beliefs of people. It's not mere enough for, in many cases, to simply share our testimony, as valuable as a testimony can be. The power of, my life was like this before Christ. Here is how he changed my life. But it takes an approach to understand what are the beliefs, because most people outside of the kingdom, they hold on to certain beliefs that keep them from investigating Christ further. And an effective movement catalyst is able to identify what these beliefs are and then to address them, which means either they're going to be adapted or they're going to be replaced. This is what I was saying, illustration of the competence of influencing others' beliefs. So I wanted to find out how open are they really. And so I brought a gospel, a leather-bound gold, a precious one, and said, I want to offer this gospel to you all. It's yours. I will hand it now to Sheikh Adam, the senior leader of the group. But if you're interested in finding out more about the message that we explored together today, go to Sheikh Adam and you can have it for a period of time. And then, if someone else is interested, pass it on to them. So I wanted them to own, and this is, oral learners, it's holistic. I wanted them to own this book, this gospel, corporately. What I didn't count on is that as soon as the meeting was kind of concluded, 2-3 men jumped up and basically said, I don't want to wait until Sheikh Adam has read it. Would you have a copy for me as well? And that showed me how genuine, their interest was. Another thing that happened before the meeting was dismissed is I sat down and they had opportunity to respond. And I just want to quote two statements that were made by one of these sheikhs present that I think are very insightful. One of the sheikhs said this. He said, you all know I have lived in the north of the country. That's where fundamentalist Islam is the strongest. And I have been to all the famous preachers and all the mosques. And brothers, I have never dared to tell you this, but today I feel we have heard the truth. And so I want you to know, all these preachers in the north, they all use religion for their personal gain. And none of them lives what they preach in the mosque. I believe what we have heard here today is truth from God, and we need to find out more about it. So I could have never said that, right? I mean, I'd seen something similar, but never could I have said this. But so I realized there is this strong facade of a society that seems so deeply entrenched in whatever their religious system is. But behind the facade, they have questions, they have doubts, they have disillusionments. And all it takes is an encounter for this to come up. And no one contradicted him. So that was one. And the other one was another sheikh who stood up and said, oh, this has been such a wonderful meeting. You know, my heart is so warm. And, you know, these sons of Jesus, that's how they called us. These sons of Jesus, they have been with us for barely a year, and they have done more good for us than Islam has in centuries. And with Islam, they meant the central government, the political system, everything. So I told you about the mobile clinic that we ran and the supplementary feeding center as a holistic expression of the kingdom of God. Our compassion ministry, I think, won their hearts that they were willing to listen to us in the first place. I think it was then the power of the gospel, the power of the truth, that opened their hearts, that they would, you know, want to find out more. So then they were dismissed, and basically I asked the question and said, you know, if you're interested, and I'm hearing some of you are interested, we can have more meetings like this. Fast forward, so we have more meetings like this, and I realize some are open, some are ready to receive the good news that if they put their trust in Jesus, that then they can enter the kingdom of God and live under the reign of God. That was in essence the gospel message that we shared. But I wanted a movement. I didn't want, you know, these individuals to be drawn into the kingdom tonight. And so I moderated that and said, you know, there is so much disunity, I said, around. You know, there is war, there is inter-tribal conflict. It is so important that you are a unity, you know, you're one. And so you've heard these voices, and these brothers, you know, are investigating the Injil, the gospel of Christ. It's so important that you talk among one another and maintain your unity. Again, multi-individual conversion, steering a group that is interested, that is taking slow steps toward Christ as a whole toward Christ, rather than those few who might have been ready already at the point, you know, to say, now you say your conversion prayer. Another thing that happened is that the rumors spread in the villages, and individuals approached us and said, you know, we've heard that you are having these conversations with our leaders about the gospel and about Jesus. Can we have a gospel too? You know, can we be part of this too? And what I did is I always referred to these authorities and said, you are very welcome. Absolutely. This is not a limited club. The gospel of Christ is for everyone. I would like you to talk to your village chief and tell him of your interest, and then he will tell you what he thinks. But you're very welcome. And then I fed that back to the group of leaders and said, guys, you know, this is your country. You're in charge. God established you as authority and as leaders. You have an immense responsibility here. I want you to know that individuals have asked my team here to also receive copies of the gospel. Everything here is in the open, you know, so I would like to discuss with you and decide with you, how do we do this? Mm-hmm. So they owned it. It was their decision. It was how they did it. And basically we explored the option, you know, would we distribute them? Would that be okay or not? And again, we want them to own it. It's theirs. So we decided with a little bit of influence, but basically their decision, they owned it, that we would offer gospels to the sheikhs, but it would be the sheikhs handing them out in their villages to whoever was interested. Another thing that happened was resistance. I mean, wherever the gospel is shared, there is some resistance, right? It's the rarest exception that there is none. So there were people in the villages complaining and saying, this is foreign. We don't want this. You know, this is not the way of Islam. And interestingly, they said themselves, you don't worry about this. We will take care of this. And I mean, I couldn't have taken care of it. I was a foreigner. I was not there all the time. I didn't know what happened in the, once the dusk is there, there's no electricity, conversations in the dark among neighbors. None of this. However, the sheikh would. And so he was the one who could deal and negotiate these objections. And so, in other words, a group journeying toward Christ, and we're taking the time to give those who are more thorough, who have more objections still, who need more truth, who need more dialogue, to give them the time until they are ready. And then after several months, that time came. And you can imagine it was one of the best weeks in my life. And then
you've got to tell us what happened.
So another meeting of that kind, again, around 50 village chiefs present, and some other men had joined, and some children were in the background, and some wives, women were also trying to listen in with one ear, but it was mostly the group of key leaders. And I explained to them that what it meant, I had, to put their trust in Jesus. And we had talked about what it means to follow him, to live the Jesus lifestyle. I explained and said, it is so important that you as a group walk this journey today. We cannot have, now fighting among you, disagreement among you. So, make sure that you all agree on this. And that took place. And so what happened then in the end was something that I first explained and then walked through, is that they all stood up and raised their hands, in prayer to God, and said a proclamation out loud together in the public, again, the village school just 50 yards away, others around. So all public, nothing in hiding. And said that they put their trust in Jesus, that they renounce Satan and all his works, and they surrender, using the words, that is used for Islam, surrendering to God, surrender their lives to Jesus. And it was evident that first, that few of them immediately, thought, right, this is me, but how about my people? How about my village? And so instantly some of them were saying, can you come to my region? So there was a Sheikh William, and he said, I'm Sheikh William in the so-and-so mountain area. I'm the Sheikh over 8 villages, 11,000 people. Every one of them needs to hear. Can you come and teach them also? Another one said, how about the schools? The next generation needs also to grow up in this gospel message. Could you train our school teachers so that this could be taught in the school? So in other words, I think what we did is they came up with the ideas for multiplication, and they were different in different regions. And we then had an individual conversation with them, what it would look like. It wasn't as though every one of the 50 plus, was a multiplier. And the story then continued in very, very different ways. A few of those initial village chiefs became leaders of Jesus groups in their village. Some were simply door openers, who probably didn't even continue a very active walk with Christ, but basically opened their village to the good news. And there was then someone else a champion who continued the work. And now thinking multiplication, thinking existing structures, in our experience, it was often then the educated younger leader. So that could be either the son of the sheikh, but maybe even the headmaster of the local school. Someone who had gone to school in town, who had a little bit of education, a little bit of broader mindset maybe, and was then the one who took it on. So often today now in the churches that exist, it is not that these village chiefs automatically have become church leaders. It is often younger men in their 30s typically who have now become the leaders and who carry on the movement. And the gospel has traveled from these original 50 villages. The fathers, I have verification that there is a church in a village is 220 kilometers away. And that part of Sudan, it's a region as big as France, has churches all over. There is no major region that is left out. They're in every major city and every town, and then also obviously not in every single village, but in villages covering all the districts. Can we record this? Yes, we can, because the government has changed its stance. Initially, they wanted to suppress the movement, but they have kind of given up. Mm-hmm. They realized this is too big to suppress. We cannot. And so they have developed an attitude, I've been told by several national leaders, where they say, oh, they have become apostates. They have become Christians. Don't care about these guys. Which shows that, if this is how the government assesses this, they have seen some of the magnitude of what has been happening. All that we contributed, I asked God about this, is, and I felt He said, you were faithful and you were there. And I was so acutely aware of it by my own weakness. The week these breakthrough meetings happened, I slept in the house of one of the chiefs, village chiefs. And, you sleep basically on the ground in a courtyard because they have only huts and the huts are too hot in the summer. And so here I was, and the wide open sky, God's, magnificent greatness displayed in the sky. And I was just plain exhausted. I was exhausted emotionally. I was exhausted physically, completely. And I didn't feel strong spiritually at all. So in utter dependence on God, saying, Father, this is you. This is so evidently you and so clearly not me. Hunger for God is one of the qualities that later my research identified is something that all effective movements have in common. So I think here you see in a state of weakness, my utter dependence of God, my hunger for God to be evident in my weakness, in spite of my weakness, and through my weakness. The second thing is boldness. Imagine, and I've thought about this 100 times. Imagine I had followed my feelings, my promptings, beautiful vaccination campaign, right? And then sat down. I mean, I believe God is sovereign. I believe there is a limitation to these reflections. But humanly speaking, could it be that all this had never happened? So there is this significant factor, I feel, in my own experience of the human responsibility. In this particular instance, my lack of boldness motivating me to see God for more boldness. And in the moment, still the choice I had, do I choose boldness now or do I choose to play it safe? And no one, in my mission, my leader, my supporter, no one would have blamed me, because this is hostile, right? And you're doing great work anyway, and you're sharing the good news. And yet, what would have been lost? So I say this with great awe, but the human factor, God has chosen to use us, his earthen vessels, yet, his glory in us. So that is a significant factor. A third factor is God continues his work with human brokenness, flaws, and immaturities. So in our case too, and I hear this from many colleagues, one of the early key leaders, he was actually the man of the first hour and the pillar of the movement, respected by everyone, training elders already himself, passing on everything he had learned. And he embellished money, he began to deceive others, and he is out now. And still God, used him for so many years, while in the background, he was already unfaithful with financial resources. How does that work? How can God be so congenial, if that's the right word, to accept it, that his servants have flaws, there is fleshly tendencies, there is brokenness, there is even sin in their lives. And yet, he used that guy, I call him Omar, he used Omar as the pillar of, almost 10 years, almost 10 years, as the key leader of the movement. How is that? Well, I don't have an answer to it other than marvel how God is so good, and also to think, at the end, God gets the credit. I think Martin Luther said, a carpenter who uses perfect tools is still a great carpenter. But imagine a carpenter who use, tools that have faults and are old and rusty, and not polished, and he still produces a masterpiece. That is a yet greater carpenter. I don't know. This is a great analogy. That's my best explanation. But God uses men and women with significant flaws, and yet he writes his story. That encourages me. More?
How did this whole experience change you?
In many ways. I think the locals have changed me. Sitting with them. So this is what we did. Now we are a community we call this Jesus groups. And in the first hour, we avoided the term church. Today, they call themselves churches. That's okay. What does it mean to share life? What do we do when we gather together? So we basically read together through the book of Acts and watched the disciples, the early disciples. Well, when they got together, what happened? What did they do? And so that's what we'll do as well. Very frankly, it was a new learning and an unlearning. What is kingdom life? Obviously, I had brought my tradition, my German way of doing, my actually conservative evangelical way of doing things, my rather traditional way. And I was open I was prepared to say the expression of the kingdom, the expression of church among Muslims or former Muslims in Sudan must look different. I was open to that. But I think I wasn't ready for the fact that it would transform me. And so, take people orientation. God made me a task-oriented person. I grew up in a culture that is known for its efficiency and, straightforwardness. wow, these people shape me in their people orientation. It's all about your honor. It's all about your face. And if you're the leader, I want to make sure that you're elevated, your status. Yes, we might get something done as well, but that is what really matters. And I learned that this is Jesus. Love your neighbor, love the person that God put in front of you is my greatest mission in the world. More important than to get anything accomplished. It transformed me. The value of relationships. In my Christian upbringing, relationships were a means to an end. Kind of, we need to get along so we get something accomplished as the simplified version, because ultimately we're really only doing things together for God. I learned from these young disciples from Muslim background who brought the cultural value of relational unity, the importance of the relational bond into the kingdom, and purified it and learned to resolve conflict in a better way than they used to, right? So they were transformed by the gospel too, but I was transformed because, wow, I haven't seen it. I haven't seen it, how Jesus forging the bond with the 12, for example, by spending time with them day and night, by sharing life with them, was his primary vehicle of launching his kingdom in the world. What does that say about how I do ministry? What does it say about the value I place on friendships in life? Has transformed me. So, in other words, something I didn't expect is that building this movement together now with new emerging leaders, new disciples, was deeply transformational for me.
Don't forget, you can spread the word about the Movements podcast by recommending it to a friend or by leaving a review in your podcast provider. I'm Steve Addison for the Movements podcast.